South Africa, known across the world for its controversial history of racial segregation. The African National Congress, a liberation movement founded in 1912, is widely applauded for its success in the struggle against the white minority government from 1948 to 1994. The party's apparent commitment to peace and non-violence is held in high regard across the world and by the United Nations in particular. Since the ANC's accession to power in 1994, historic events have been claimed. Memorials have been erected, museums have been built, history books have been rewritten, and heroes have been declared. This is, however, not the complete story.
Taking his first steps to a new South Africa.
In order to satisfy the ambitions of certain politicians.
Is 19 years old. He doesn't know it yet, but in a matter of days, he will become the most wanted person in South Africa. In 2 months, he will flee the country. But Donald doesn't go by his birth name. History will remember him as Tsietsi.
The known faces and the known names was to start with Tsietsi Mashinini, who was my junior at high school.
Mashinini organizes a meeting to discuss ways in which the youth can rise up against the introduction of Afrikaans as instruction medium by the Department of Bantu Education. The energy between these youths was sparked mainly by the philosophy of black consciousness as articulated by the leader of the black consciousness movement, Steve Biko.
We see a completely non-racial society. We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights, because guaranteeing minority rights implies the recognition of portions of the community on a race basis. We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
Remember that Tsietsi, before he met Steve Biko and the politics of black consciousness, he called himself Donald. He was Donald Mashinini. Donald Mashinini had a name at home which was Tsietsi Mashinini. Now Tsietsi means trouble. So when 76 started and became a leader, he then used that name, Tsietsi, and he became this troublesome leader who was in the forefront.
On the morning of the 16th of June 1976, Mashinini leads the students into the Soweto Uprisings, which will in time be known as one of the greatest single events to lead to the ultimate destruction of the white minority government in South Africa.
Between 10,000 and 20,000 students took part in the mass protest perennium. The average age of these students were between 18 and 25, although younger scholars were also involved. The age of Tsietsi Mashinini was 19 years. Many of the policemen deployed in Soweto at that stage were more or less of the same age.
Over 140 buildings are burned to the ground and more or less the same number of vehicles are destroyed.
The police came up, they ordered the crowd to disperse, the order wasn't heard, there was no warning shot, and suddenly Hector Peterson, 13-year-old youth, was shot in the head.
The protest march erupted into violence, and 23 persons were killed on the first day.
Among the deaths are two noteworthy people. The first is 13-year-old Hector Peterson, who is shot dead by the police. A picture of Peterson being carried away from the revolt will become one of the best-known photographs ever to be taken in South Africa. It is circulated across the world and creates significant international support for the plea of young black South Africans against the South African government. The other is Dr. Melville Edelstein, a man who devoted his life to the upliftment of black South Africans. He is caught by a group of protesting students, stoned to death and left with a sign around his neck that says, "Beware Afrikaners."
Afrikaans was viewed as a language of the people who were oppressing us. But the spark at the time could have been anything, because the revolution, the atmosphere was ripe for revolution. Our parents were now being politicized, so anything could have become a spark for that revolution. And unfortunately, or fortunately in this case, Afrikaans became that spark that starts the revolution of 1976. So anybody who says we went to die, we went to jail, we went to exile, we became maimed because we didn't want Afrikaans. Afrikaans was not something to die for. What was there to die for was the country. Afrikaans became a spark.
Policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness, accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do. As good neighbors always do. As good neighbors always do.
The apartheid system as applied by the Prime Minister Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd is essentially a system of separate development, according to which homelands are awarded to different cultural groups living within the territorial state of South Africa. The idea is to regard this territory as similar to Europe, and different peoples are therefore awarded distinct homelands, similar to the variety of states that exist in Europe. But grand apartheid, which focuses on homelands for different peoples, becomes a micromanaged small apartheid, which ultimately leads to a society that is completely divided along racial lines. The policy of separate development soon becomes discredited, and resistance to the South African government grows as race relations deteriorate.
Well, the ANC decided upon armed struggle after a long period of consideration, because the ANC was essentially at the beginning a peaceful organization that it wanted to resolve the problems of South Africa through dialogue.
There were far more racist and repressive states in South Africa in the 1980s, but few of them had gone through the business or bother of codifying their system and creating it into state law, as the apartheid government did, and therefore it was not only a moral target, it was a relatively speaking easy target. And then of course there was the confluence of actors in the Cold War.
In 1960, the ANC is declared an illegal organization as a result of its involvement in illegal activities and its alliance with the South African Communist Party. Fixed on leading South Africa on the path towards a communist state, the SACP experiences difficulties in gathering support. It finds an ally in the ANC.
The relationship was very close, very trusting, very, very tight, and of same mind. It had this Marxist compass, way of revolutionary analysis.
Some of its most prominent leaders are already imprisoned. They include Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Nelson Mandela, the founder of the ANC's military wing, better known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, or MK. Other leaders such as Oliver Tambo, Chris Hani, Thabo Mbeki, and Jacob Zuma flee the country and operate in exile from abroad. The ANC's alliance with the South African Communist Party, however, proves to be fruitful in strengthening the organization.
Soviets were very much interested in South Africa because the formation of South African Communist Party in 1921 was monitored by Comintern at that time, by Stalin himself.
We have to fight a war. If nobody is going to give us weapons, the Soviet Union is gratefully willing to give us weapons.
AK-47, that's the real weapon of mass destruction. I mean, look how many people, hundreds of millions of people were murdered all over the world with that. And they were turning out this AK-47, providing all the liberation movements through their proxies, sometimes directly. Then they had in the southern Russia, they had camps to train terrorists, KGB camps, to train terrorists from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, from the Basques, from Middle East. They were providing them with everything, with expertise, with armaments, with financial support, with logistical support. The whole idea was to stir this world revolution.
The strategy is to have a vanguard of people that serves as a small engine. The big engine is an umbrella organization, which is the ANC. However, the big engine is directed by the vision of the small engine, which is the Communist Party.
Communists within the ANC should lead the ANC to the goals of the Communist Party. So Soviet Union was very much involved. They wouldn't consider it as a local thing. They would consider it as a part of the worldwide struggle.
You get that closeness of leadership, not only right at the apex, but throughout the ANC and the liberation movement with communists who are members of both. It was no problem if you were a member of the Communist Party, whether known or unknown or suspected. There was no problem about being a loyal member of the ANC and indeed becoming a leader within the ANC.
Mr. Zuma joined Communist Party in 1962, very long time ago. He joined the ANC when he was 17 years old and Communist Party already when he was 20 years old. People like Mbeki, who was also a member of Politburo of the Communist Party, like Nelson Mandela, also a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party, they were promoting the line of the Communist Party within the ANC. And the line of the Communist Party is Marxism-Leninism as the final liberation. And the people like Joe Slovo, for example, people like Oliver Tambo and other communist leaders of South Africa, they would get their instructions from Moscow. Zuma, he went from Lusaka, he was in Moscow and he was part of the worldwide KGB training of terrorists, we would call them, or they would call it the fighters for freedom.
At the time of the Soweto Uprisings, and despite substantial support from communist countries abroad, the ANC has a hard time implementing its strategy for an armed struggle.
There was no ANC, not underground, maybe under the ground, but there was no ANC. And I always, when I address people, I always remind them to say, if there was ANC at the time, if there was Mkhonto at the time, why did we have to take stones and dustbin lids to defend ourselves and fight the bullets? In 1976, anybody who says the ANC was involved will be telling a lie.
While the South African economy grows at a rapid pace, the ANC struggles with internal conflict. One of the most notable is the campaign of Chris Hani, communist and military leader, against the lavish and opulent lifestyles of ANC leaders in exile.
The general sense within the country was that the ANC was moribund. Its armed struggle had gone nowhere. It had no presence at all.
The ANC fails. In 1964, the president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, remarked that it appears as if the guns of MK have been silenced for all time. Although the Soweto Uprisings flare up despite the absence of the ANC, the party greatly benefits from the political consequences of the revolt.
Indeed, what the revolt did was to lead thousands of young people to the conclusion that they must leave the country, that they must go and seek military training and come back to fight the police. And when they left the country, The ANC, with the Soviet Union now pouring much more support into its coffers, was the only organization that really had the capacity to take them in, bring them into camps, feed them, train them, subject them, of course, also to propaganda and political education.
The ANC had several camps outside South Africa, had camps in Tanzania, in places like Congo.
Places like Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, Morogoro, Zambia, Lusaka.
But when the uprising took place, students left en masse to get out of the country, not necessarily intent on joining any particular organization.
Maybe a tenth of them knew a little bit about the ANC. Maybe 5% had uncles or relatives who had been in the ANC, but 90% knew very little. When I met up with these young people, it was a little surprising. I remember, because I was lecturing them in some camps, and I noticed how they preferred, many of them, to speak Afrikaans or Tsotsitaal, which was filled with Afrikaans phrases. And I could remember one day pretending to scratch my head and saying, "You guys, you revolted against Afrikaans, but jy hou baie van die taal, eh?" And of course they'd all laugh.
There came a need for more camps to be opened and other countries to be accessed. Because they found the African National Congress, it was fertile ground for us to recruit.
It was almost like a transfusion of blood. Maybe a better metaphor is an incredible intake of oxygen.
The circumstances in these camps are appalling, and gross human rights violations take place. Most notorious of all is Camp Quattro, a detention facility where prisoners of the ANC have to undergo what is referred to as rehabilitation programs. Prisoners in camps such as Quattro are subjected to extreme levels of torture. Although many prisoners die as a result of these actions, the exact number of casualties remains unknown. Some of the survivors go public about the atrocities that occur in these ANC camps. Yet little is known about the leaders behind these tortures. Later, the ANC will refuse to provide the names of the leaders who manage these camps. What is known, however, is that in 1991, ANC President Nelson Mandela orders a commission of inquiry into abuses within the ANC in exile. Mandela's proposal is met with fierce opposition from within the ANC's National Executive Committee. Mandela's instruction to investigate these atrocities is adamantly opposed by 3 ANC veterans in particular, namely Joe Nhlanhla, Chris Hani, and Jacob Zuma.
There were detentions in Angola. I have no knowledge of those detentions because most of the time I was deployed in the forward areas. I did not participate in some of those detentions, but people were necessarily detained because of their activities against our movement. There necessarily had to be action taken against them in the camps. That in any camp, generally, when people engage in misdemeanor, you detain them, not necessarily in a prison as such, but there are detention facilities in any military camp.
Were there rehabilitation programs at these camps?
I have no idea.
The outflux of young people results in dramatic growth in ANC membership. But at the time, the organization does not have a strategy for taking the struggle against the government further. With the ANC largely out of the picture, the Soviets know that something must be done to catapult the ANC back into the South African political landscape.
During 1978, a high-level delegation of the ANC, led by the president of the alliance, Mr. Oliver Tambo, departed on a so-called study tour to Vietnam. The object of the tour was to conduct a research into the strategy and methodology employed by the Vietnamese in their struggle against the French and United States of America.
Vietnam also was a proxy, was a client of the Soviet Union. And they thought, at that time, Konstantin Brutans, Deputy Director of International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and he was in charge of Africa. activities of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He thought that Vietnam would be a very good training center for the people from South Africa, because that would be more or less the same issues would be involved.
I think they went partly at the suggestion of the Soviet Union, which had been backing the ANC for many years and was now beginning to be concerned that they had backed the wrong horse. Because whereas the ANC had not sparked the Soweto revolt, it was also being eclipsed inside the country by the BC organizations and by Inkatha. But in Vietnam, there was a model of what could be done in this kind of situation.
Vietnam had defeated the United States, in essence. Defeated them in battle, engaged with, they had defeated several countries, the Portuguese, the United States, the France, and they had vast experience of fighting against vastly superior military forces. And obviously we could learn a lot from Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh strategies, from Vong Vie and Giap's engagement with superior forces. So that's why they went there, to try to learn, to try to get experiences from these vast resources that the Vietnamese had.
Now, the Vietnamese gave advice to Mr. Mbeki, according to our intelligence reports, that they should avoid a bush war, in other words, a cross-border type of war, and they should rather take the operations to the townships, where it would be much more difficult for the defense force, because in the bush war you could use your full force. In the townships you couldn't.
The ANC, after that, changed their strategy of the armed struggle and started with the AMP, or terror campaign.
This strategy is generally referred to as the People's War.
It was the ANC that switched over from a normal cross-border bush war to taking the battle to the cities.
The concept of a People's War was developed by Mao Zedong. He was the founder of the People's Republic of China and also the chairman of the Communist Party of China.
The People's War is a very complicated strategy, and it has very many different elements. Perhaps the easiest way to describe it is to say that it has two main strands: a political struggle, which could take many forms, including demonstrations, and a military struggle, which in more accurate translation from the Vietnamese is a program of violence. And the two must work together.
Of course, there's struggles where the military side is very much to the fore, but the organization of the people for revolutionary change is the fundamental.
The idea is that all people living within the arena of conflict are regarded as combatants and as weapons of war, which are expendable just in the way that conventional arms would be expendable in a conventional war. So that people must be drawn into the political struggle. They must go out into the streets and demonstrate. They must also give aid and support to those who are waging the program of violence. And together, they create a sense of ferment in the country. They contribute to a situation of ungovernability, when in particular the representatives of the state at local level, local councillors, local policemen, tribal chiefs can be driven out, and a liberated area can be created. And the more the liberated areas expand, the more the power of both the government and of all political rivals is reduced.
Suddenly we had a loud bang. The windows were broken. They just shot my mother.
They are now being used as pawns in this heckling for power amongst these leaders and so on.
People's War was supposed to rest on the so-called four pillars of the revolution, namely the activities of the ANC SSP Alliance as the vanguard organization, including those of the underground structures, the mass mobilization as directed by the ANC SSP. This includes also the arming of the masses, the activities of Counter Wisizwe, and the international isolation of the RSA.
The first order of business before the People's War can be executed is to discuss the ANC's new and improved strategy with Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the leader of Inkatha. Founded in 1975 from within the ranks of the ANC, Inkatha is initially a cultural organization and ally of the ANC. However, this is about to change.
Inkatha already had that kind of presence. By 1979, it had 300,000 members, which was incidentally 3 times more than the ANC had ever had at the height of its popularity. So if the ANC was successfully to wage people's war, it would be very useful to make an ally of Inkatha and draw it under its wing.
But in 1979, this issue hotted up, and Mr. Tambo then requested me to come to London.
The two leaders cannot agree with one another on various issues. Although Buthelezi agrees with ANC's objectives, he fiercely disagrees on the strategy to achieve this.
My methods are non-violent methods, and I believe that, we should accomplish the same thing that they want, but through peaceful means, because I think if we escalate violence, there cannot be destruction, not only for our people, but of the whole country and the infrastructure. And there's nothing that frightens me more than to face a country which has no infrastructure.
The ANC's plan is to embark on an armed struggle against the South African government, to persuade the international community to initiate sanctions against South Africa, to encourage children to boycott the education system, and to initiate a consumer boycott within South Africa.
Well, the ANC came out with the slogan, "Liberation now, education later." And I countered this with education for liberation.
In this country, the tragedy in the black community, that children have been victims of the whole unrest, in that many people taking advantage that the children as children don't have much experience. And that's not to denigrate them. These are just the facts of the matter, because they haven't had the experience. Then they take advantage of that and mislead them and use them. In fact, I think it's criminal, because many of them who do so have got their own children in schools, but then they expect children of other people not to benefit from schooling.
As time went on, there arose this issue of imposing economic sanctions and disinvestment against South Africa. So when that happened, there was a big debate, because it was the ANC Mission Exile which was actually urging the international community to impose these sanctions on this country. Now, I could not agree with that. I didn't accept it. And in fact, I tested it, because I addressed very huge meetings, and whenever I raised it, when there were thousands of African people, whether in fact we should support sanctions, they would say with one voice, no, we would starve. We mustn't support sanctions.
When the leaders of Owusa asked me to come to this inauguration, I felt that we needed to consult you as black South Africans on this hot, contentious issue of imposing sanctions and disinvestment on this country.
Once the ANC saw that Inkatha was not willing to play the role that the ANC wanted for it in waging the People's War, then Inkatha was simply a political rival, something that had to be weakened and eliminated if possible, drawn onto the ANC's turf if possible, and this had to happen before the first all-race election took place. Otherwise, there was a real risk that the ANC would not win that election. Instead, it would be likely to be won by Inkatha and the BC organizations, and perhaps other rivals as well.
The ANC was very angry with me. Then they started a campaign against me. I could not agree to support their policy of sanction against South Africa and taking up arms against the South African army.
The ANC is ready to execute its people's war. The first priority is to render South Africa's townships ungovernable. Due to a lack of support, the ANC is unable to organize mass protest rallies at the time. Instead, smaller groups of people are used to sabotage buildings and fuel havoc in black townships. Scuffles with the police further discredit the South African government and boost the image of the ANC.
Propaganda was key. There were no support structures, so we had to rekindle the spirit of resistance in our people through armed activity. We put our people in mine dumps so that they could engage in propaganda activities to announce that the African National Congress was back, blowing up railway lines, blowing up government buildings, attacking police stations and so on, just to inspire our people.
There was a time when Chief Buthelezi was a more popular black leader than Mandela, who had been put in jail for many years. Inkatha, in a nutshell, was a powerful political rival, and the ANC, drawing on the lessons from Vietnam, needed to weaken it before apartheid crumbled. And in 1984, when the People's War began, the ANC, the SACP, and their mentors in the Soviet Union were confident that apartheid would be gone within 10 years. Within that period, Inkatha must also have been weakened so that the ANC could attain the hegemony it wanted to pursue the further stages of the revolution in the post-apartheid period.
There was a lot of attacks on me, even on Radio Freedom. Mr. Chief said, Gacha Buthelezi is a snake that poisons South Africa, that must be hit on the head. There's no doubt about it that there was a program. There were songs they were singing. They are coming with their bazookas. I mean, those are not threats against whites. So it was not surprising to us that that war was not unleashed against whites and the white army, but was unleashed against us.
Janet, what happened, Jack?
They attacked us.
Who attacked you, Janet?
The youths.
The youth?
Yeah.
How many youths were there, Janet?
More than 50.
More than 50? Do you know if they belong to any political party?
UDF.
You say they belong to UDF? Are you an Inkatha member? No.
Not. Oh, my brother is not.
Your brother is? All right, you know, just lay still. They're getting an ambulance. It won't be long now.
It's taking too long.
No, they'll be all right very shortly. All right. What did they do to you, Janet?
Stabbed me.
They've stabbed you?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just lie very still, eh?
And they poured petrol on us.
They poured petrol on you?
On us. We were lying, the three of us, the women. We were lying.
And then?
They poured petrol on us.
Janet, did they say anything to you?
They just said the dogs must die.
The dogs must die?
Yeah.
Violence escalates dramatically. Initially, violent protests occur in areas such as the Vaal Triangle and the Eastern Cape, but mostly in the province of Natal, the heartland of the Inkatha movement.
Initially, there were debates as to which philosophy is correct for our country, be it the Black Consciousness philosophy or the Freedom Charter or the Pan-African. So that debate was healthy. We could engage. We were caught by surprise somewhere in the early 80s. We believe it was under the direction of the ANC that they became intolerant of the Black Consciousness movement. They became intolerant of the philosophy and started attacking us. It even went to an extent where houses were burned. It went to an extent where people were executed. It went to an extent where people were necklaced.
We have a list of more than 400 people who we knew, people with whom we struggled, people whom we knew so well that we knew even how many teaspoons of sugar they put in their tea, who were killed either waiting for the buses or taxis or in their houses and so on, because they were attacked by the ANC. The AK-47 rifles, therefore, came into the country. Many of them were used to mow down our people. Because they would be attacked, then our people would also counterattack, defend themselves. And then preemptive violence, as this thing gained momentum, then even some IFP people would do preemptive attacks. But there was never any decision of our decision-making body, the National Council, where we decided that we should attack or that anyone should be attacked. This thing became spontaneous. The only thing I said, which is on record, I said it was an inalienable right of citizens in terms of our common law that everyone has a right to defend himself and his loved ones. And I urged our people to defend themselves.
Inkatha was also a thorn in the flesh of the ANC-SSP alliance, and many of the Inkatha leaders and supporters were murdered. There was no real threat to white members. Well, that was almost non-existent.
The people who really suffered as a result of the disruption of services, as a result of violence, as a result of boycotts, were black South Africans.
Although the use of violence has strengthened the ANC, it has trouble operating as an illegal organization. This results in the founding of the UDF as a front organization to operate within South Africa. This step allows ANC activists to openly campaign for political change under the banner of an organization that has not been declared illegal. The UDF is also used to recruit young people in its struggle.
On the 8th of January 1984, Mr. Oliver Tambo, in his presidential address, laid special emphasis on the concept of ungovernability. Black members of the police, black councillors and their families were targeted, murdered, and their houses set alight. In the most of the black townships, the local authorities collapsed.
Detective Warrant Officer Templeton Sibaka had his house burnt down 2 months ago in Duduza.
We were at the charge office and we were monitoring all the news from Duduza. It's then that I heard my house was on fire and several other police houses. I lost absolutely everything. It was my clothes, my wife's clothes, my children's clothes, and everything in the house. The houses were actually broken down and nothing was left. They were broken down brick for brick because they were burnt down on Saturday. And then the Sunday, the group went back to these houses again and they started breaking them down. And everything just was totally destroyed.
And do you feel that you can go back now?
At the moment, I feel I cannot go back. And I might as well say I feel we will never be accepted by the people of Duduza again from what they have already done to us.
Because you're a policeman?
Because I'm a policeman.
Black members were driven from their homes, and we had, in some cases, to accommodate these members.
By this time, the ANC has learned the value of involving the youth in its struggle for power. The Ungovernability campaign also assists in creating an atmosphere of chaos in South Africa's townships, which provides the ANC with opportunities to fuel the struggle.
One of you standing here are communists. A communist is a person who fights for freedom. Our leaders are called communists because they fight for you.
Well, there are various advantages from a revolutionary perspective in using children. The one is that they have much less fear than an adult. So a child will go onto the street armed with a petrol bomb and throw it at a policeman, where an adult might think twice about it. But more than that, where children were then arrested by the police or killed in the course of confrontations between the police and the crowds, children had huge propaganda value. There would be far much more outrage, far more of an outcry when children were either wounded or killed. And that propaganda could be used to the advantage of the ANC to build anger, to build the kind of hatred which you need to propagate a people's war, and to discredit those who could be blamed for the child's death, whether it was the police or the army, or in some instances, Inkatha and other ANC rivals.
I remember at that time in the Soviet Union there was absolutely no reporting of any kind of violence on the behalf of ANC, on behalf of the military wing of ANC, on behalf of intelligence units of the embassy in Zambia.
The media reports were completely inaccurate. I actually was in charge of the government's communication arm during this period. And the reality was that the international media had arrived in South Africa in the expectation of regime change. They were not interested in even 1/10 of the government's side of the story. They were interested in the next big revolutionary spectacular. That is what they were shooting for, and they became part of the story. At certain stages, they were working hand in glove with the UDF to organize demonstrations that would be photogenic.
There's no doubt, as far as the security branch is concerned, that most of the media reporting was in a biased manner. Reporting was not balanced. We had to take steps against the SABC for reporting or distorting certain facts, and they were found guilty.
We have the situation in these areas where people are afraid to come forward because they are afraid of intimidation and, of course, for revenge.
For black journalists living in townships who are now caught up in this ferment, it was very difficult to report accurately because of the fear that had been generated. And in 1990, in fact, the Institute convened a workshop with black journalists to talk about the kind of pressures that they faced. And some of them said, yes, if there's a meeting in the township and not many people attended, you have to add a couple of noughts to make it seem as if there really was a big presence there. Because if you don't do that, then the whisper begins to go around that you're against the struggle. And heaven help you if you're against the struggle, because by implication, the penalty for that could be the netless execution.
The ANC makes progress with a Vietnam-inspired strategy which they adopt in 1978. By 1985, it succeeds largely in establishing itself not only as a major role player in the struggle for a new South Africa, but in the eyes of the international community, also as the favourite to one day take over the South African government. Pro-ANC protest rallies erupt across the world, and the Free Mandela movement becomes popular among young people from all continents. Between September 1984 and May 1985, close to 150 councillors have their homes or businesses destroyed. To assess the gains it has made and to find ways of taking the struggle to new heights, the ANC organises a national consultative conference in Kabwe, Zambia in June 1985. Overall, the conference agrees on the need to intensify all elements of the People's War in order to make South Africa ungovernable. An important outcome at the Kabwe conference is, however, the decision that soldiers of Umkhonto we Sizwe no longer have to differentiate between hard and soft targets during armed activities.
Many of the people speaking there were saying that we needed to up the struggle, intensify it, not hold back by being too concerned about what the Americans, I don't like the term, would call collateral damage.
No distinction was made between civilian and military targets, and the aims were to sow fear and terror. They resorted to the use of car bombs, landmines, limpet mines, hand grenades, and other explosive devices.
Lede van die SASP
Regardless whether defenseless civilians, including women or children, were killed or maimed, a significant number of civilians, including women and children, were killed during these attacks.
We thought that some of the things we were doing were actually, we looked like fighting with one hand tied to the back. And we had to take decisions like the one we took about farmers. We wanted to take the struggle to the wide areas, such that if anybody dies in the crossfire, it should not just be Africans who die in the crossfire.
You know, the essence of a people's war, it regards all the people living in the arena of conflict as combatants who are expendable in the war in the same way as arms and ammunition are expendable in a conventional conflict. So a people's war cannot really distinguish between hard and soft targets. A people's war, by definition, will use civilians in any way it can and will draw as much propaganda advantage out of civilian deaths as it can.
The decision on hard and soft targets at the Kabwe conference is partly sparked by an event that happened 2 years before, when a car bomb was set off during rush hour in front of the South African Air Force headquarters in Church Street, Pretoria.
In the case of the Church Street car bomb incident, a vehicle with a powerful load of explosives was detonated around 4 o'clock in the afternoon in front of the Nedbank Square building, and altogether 19 persons were brutally killed. 12 of them were civilians and 7 members of the defense force. 219 were severely injured, of which 217 were civilians and 2 members of the defense force. In that case, the police had together the parts of the body which was spread over a large distance and to put it in a plastic bag.
Shortly after the Kabwe conference, the ANC's new plan of ungovernability starts to escalate, and the policy on soft targets is put into action. A total of 136 bomb attacks is recorded in 1985, up from only 44 in 1984. Civilian casualties rise sharply. In December 1985, a landmine explodes near Messina, killing 6 members of the Van Eck and Denison families who are on holiday on a private game farm when the device goes off. 4 of the deceased are young children.
Ons het die landmyn met 'n bakkie afgetrap, sy regter agterwiele die landmyn getref. Die voertuig is deur die lug geslinger en het 'n eind daarvan af op die grond geval, waarna ons in vlamme gehul was. Toe ek by myself kom, het ek gemerk dat my baba seentjie van 18 maande, wat op my skoot gesit het, dat hy nog leef, en hy het vir my gekyk. Dit het vir my gelyk of hy niks mekeer nie. Die voertuig was in vlamme gehul. Ek het gesien dat meneer Denison, wat die voertuig bestuur het, op die stuurwiel lê en sy hare was aan die brand en daar erg bloed by sy voorkop uitgespuit. Ek het probeer uit die voertuig uitklim, maar as gevolg van die impak van hierdie slag was ek nie in staat om dit te doen nie. Ek het die deur probeer oopskop en ek kon ook nie daarin slaag nie. Ek het besef dat ons gaan doodbrand binne in hierdie voertuig, want ons het net voor die aanvang van ons rit het ons die voertuig vol brandstof gemaak. Ek het toe deur die venster geklim en my seentjie saam met my gevat en hom aan die pad neergesit langsaan. Ek het reg agter die voertuig, omtrent 5 meter daar vandaan, het ek my vrou en mevrou Marie Denison aangetref, erg vermink en op slag dood. Hierna het ek verder begin rondsoek, en na 'n geruime tydjie het ek op my dogtertjie en haar vriendinnetjie afgekom, waar hulle dood lê. Net hierna het ek op klein Kobus Denison afgekom, wat nog lewe in hom gehad het. Ek het teruggegaan na sy pa toe, en vir hom dit gesê dat die kind lewe nog, maar dat hy erg vermink is en verbrand was. Hy, meneer Denison, het daar op die toneel gevra dat die kind maar moet gaan, wat ook toe gebeur het. Verder het ek begin soek na my seentjie van 3 jaar oud, maar ek kon hom nie vind nie. Tot vandag toe kon ek hom nie vind nie.
The fact that farms were designated as veritable targets in our struggle evolved during our campaign in the 80s, and I also became involved in that because Following on our conference at Kabwe, one of the things we had observed was the increasing activity of farmers, South African farmers, being part of the South African Security Force network. They were part of what was called commandos. So we began to regard them as a legitimate target as well, because they were in our line, they were on our way. They were acting against us, they were informing against us, they were shooting us. We planned against them as well. That's why we planted landmines where they were patrolling as soldiers in uniform, so that we drive them away as well. Technically, people could say those farmers are just farmers, and these farmers were defending themselves. But we began to identify why we should regard them as targets. Also, there might be soft targets because, I mean, they're farmers and they have wives and children staying with them in those farms. And they might be with their families when they tread on those landmines that we wanted to plant on their farms. But we thought, since they are assisting and abating the system and trying to help the apartheid regime to survive, that they become legitimate targets. Those were the sorts of things we were dealing with.
1 week after the landmine incident near Messina, another bomb attack shocks the country. This time in Amanzimtoti. A bomb explodes in a restaurant in a shopping center on the 23rd of December 1985, while people are up and about doing their Christmas shopping. The bomber is ANC Youth League member Andrew Zondo. Zondo is arrested soon after the attack, trailed and executed. The sentence is handed down by Judge Ramon Leon, whose son will later become the leader of South Africa's opposition party.
My father was a Supreme Court judge for over 22 years in Natal, and he was opposed to the death penalty, but felt that he was obliged under his oath of office to impose a sentence when, in this case, there was murder without extenuating circumstances. So the issue with the Zondo case was exactly that. It was a shopping centre in the middle of Amanzimtoti, which was frequented by whites, Indians, blacks, just on the night before Christmas Eve. So there was no military or strategic object. It was intended to induce terror.
Yeah, well, of course it was controversial. And Andrew himself apologized, if you recall, for that action. But the fact that Andrew Zondo was engaged in such an act does not make him an outcast in our own vocabulary. He's still our hero, he's still a hero, I agree. But of course, the action itself was unfortunate.
The ANC later accepts responsibility for the attack and even changes the name of Amanzimtoti's main street from Kingsway to Andrew Zondo Street. The use of young people like Andrew Zondo in the armed struggle escalates, especially after the Kabwe conference. Another phenomenon that greatly escalates is the use of the so-called necklace as a method to kill people who are accused of collaborating with the enemy.
The necklace method to murder a person was, with any doubt, one of the most horrifying, cruel, savage and barbarous manner to murder a person.
If you are labeled a sellout, then a group of people would come and attack you.
The victim would be caught, his hands would be bound behind his back, often with wire.
This necklace is where they put a tie around a person.
They will apprehend you.
The rubber tire would be hung around his neck, hence the name necklace, and then it would be filled with petrol. And then the next step would be the striking of the match that would set the petrol on fire.
It was horrifying to see incidents recorded on video where the victims were slowly burned to death, to hear their screams of agony and pain, and to see The members or supporters of the ANC SSP Alliance dancing in a circle around these victims, jeering, shouting and laughing.
Knowing that this was coming was absolutely terrifying for anybody caught up in that situation. In addition, I think in the black community there's a strong belief that the burning of the body would also destroy the soul, would prevent the communication that people need through the dead, through their ancestors, with God, with the Creator. And so there was physical horror, but there was also a psychological element in it as well that was very powerful. That if a person was burnt to death, then the link to the ancestors would be broken.
Come in. Come in. Come in. Come.
We have comrades today who can come and sit here like I'm sitting and testify to you how, by some miracle, they escaped a necklace because the tire had already been hung around their neck, petrol had already been poured. The only thing that we needed was matches. And by some miracle, the police van came and they ran away and he escaped. Now, that also weakened the organization because a lot of people who were in the leadership of the Black Consciousness Movement and AZAPO then said, no, but when we got into politics, we never thought we'd die in the hands of our own brothers, and they sat back.
During the period 1980 to 1990, 541 incidents of the necklace methods were recorded. 36 survived, although their bodies and faces were brutally marred. During the same period, a number of 1,030 incidents were recorded where persons were set alight and burned, in certain cases, to death. 320 survived, but they were equally marred.
It started, I think, spontaneously. It's something that we saw as well and did not support or encourage. And it's something that we preached against.
While popular belief has it that the leadership of the ANC does not condone the use of the necklace to commit murder against civilians, there are in fact recorded cases of senior ANC leaders accepting or even encouraging the use of the necklace as a method of murder.
On television, on national television, Mrs. Winnie Mandela said, with our matches and tires, we liberate this country.
With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
When Mr. Zo was questioned by journalists abroad about this killing of people through necklaces, he was asked, and he said, well, if that is the method that our people have chosen to liberate ourselves at home, we go along with it.
Fear would spread enormously among all the people who witnessed it, both at the time or through the TV coverage, and it would be useful in spreading the message to the citizenry of South Africa that the revolutionaries were gaining in power and that the only way to keep yourself safe is to be on the side of the revolutionaries.
By 1986, fear sets in. Extended terror campaigns are executed successfully. Black councillors and police officers in particular realize that they and their families will become targets if they speak out or act against the ANC and its people's war. the ANC has succeeded in creating chaos in South Africa's townships.
You needed to have this ferment on the ground. You needed to have a sense of the country becoming ungovernable, because that in a way provides cover for the program of violence. If there hadn't been any such demonstrations, but you simply had necklace killings, or you had councillors being attacked and shot or burnt to death, there would probably have been a sort of sense of revulsion against this kind of violence. It would more easily have been seen as terror. But when it's in the context of a great mass upsurge, then this seems to give it an element of legitimacy. And that's why you needed to have the demonstrations as well, why you needed the political struggle to be expanding in conjunction with the military struggle, to use the terminology of People's War.
The government responds with a fierce hand, declaring a state of emergency.
Well, in a situation such as this, the government carries the responsibility for the safety of all the people. That includes the white people as well as the black people living in the townships.
The situation was becoming unmanageable in many parts of the country. The daily episodes of unrest, violence, broadcast overseas on overseas television had destroyed international confidence in the economy. It had created expectations that there would be a revolutionary and not a negotiated takeover. So the state of emergency in June 1986 was absolutely essential. They were to restore order, to restore services, and to create an environment conducive to negotiations. And they actually succeeded in all three of these goals. By 1988, the level of violence throughout the country had subsided dramatically. The revolutionary expectations had been counteracted, and this was essential on the road to creating an environment for negotiations.
By 1989, a degree of order is restored in the townships, when suddenly the international community is shaken by a development in the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall, the greatest international symbol of communism and the strength of the Soviet Union, falls. After the resignation of P.W. Botha, the new state president, F.W. de Klerk, is prepared to start negotiations with the ANC.
So suddenly, at the beginning of 1990, all of the traffic lights had gone green, and the biggest one was the collapse of the Soviet Union. For us, throughout the 80s, our main strategic threat had been the Soviet Union and its close alliance with the South African Communist Party. End of the 1980s, suddenly we had a new global economic and strategic paradigm. There was no other show in town. Communism was discredited, and we knew that there would never again be such a good opportunity to start negotiations as the beginning of 1990. So F.W. de Klerk looked at all of the things that were required to get negotiations going, including the unbanning of the ANC and the Communist Party, including the release of Nelson Mandela.
While the fall of the Berlin Wall delivers a devastating blow to the ANC, and while the South African government argues that this event places them in a superior position to initiate negotiations, the actions of the president place South Africa on a course from which there will be no return.
History had placed white South Africans on the back of a tiger. The tiger was getting increasingly unhappy and angry. The international community was shouting at us saying, "Get off the tiger." But of course, it's not easy to dismount a tiger without being eaten. And that was the dilemma of the National Party during the 80s. How was South Africa going to introduce a just political dispensation that would not lead directly to the demise of democracy and to the demise of the minorities?
'n toespraak wat sonder twyfel in die geskiedenis sal staan as 'n waterskeiding in die Suid-Afrikaanse politieke ontwikkelingsproses, is vandag deur die staatspresident, meneer F.W. de Klerk, met die opening van die jaarsparlementsitting gelewer.
Into a new South Africa.
Vanaand 'n netwerk ingrypende aankondigings deur president de Klerk lui 'n nuwe politieke tydvak in.
I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released, also in my 2 discussions with him, late last year and last evening. I came to the conclusion that he is committed to a peaceful solution and a peaceful process. The final test is the situation on the ground, and everything will depend upon the question whether we get an increase in unrest or whether we get a decrease in unrest.
I myself had at no time entered into negotiations about the future of our country.
You know that I campaigned for the release of Mr. Mandela more than any person. I feel no contradiction about that. To the extent that Mr. de Klerk, when he made the announcement in Parliament, I'm the only person he mentioned by name as having helped him to make that decision to release Mr. Mandela. And Mr. Mandela, at the huge rally in Durban, the very first one, he thanked me publicly in Inkatha for doing so, you see. So then when he was released, shortly after a few days, he phoned me to say that he would like us to meet. But somehow that meeting didn't take place, and I was surprised.
We're not happy with Mandela's release and to be taken to Victor Verster. Number one, we said, why is he getting preferential treatment?
Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela is released on the 11th of February 1990. The original agreement, namely that Mandela will be released on the precondition that he denounces violence, has been withdrawn. Mandela is immediately rushed into making his first public appearance. The world anticipates a call for peace, but is taken aback by what they hear.
I salute the African National Congress. I salute combatants of Umkhonto weSizwe. I salute the South African Communist Party. I salute the United Democratic Front. I pay tribute to the endless heroism of the youth. You, the young lions, have energized our entire struggle.
The government would have preferred a more moderate and constructive speech, but the reality is that Mandela was an ANC cadre under discipline. He was given the speech by his organization, and like a good cadre, he delivered it. I don't think it was necessarily his own view of how things should have developed, but he was following the party line.
I thought it was a terrible speech, and I watched it on TV. I thought, wow, this is the man we've been waiting for 27 years, and this is what he has said. It was a sort of speech of party political phraseology, none of which was all reassuring for the modern world as it then was.
Now is the time to intensify the struggle on all fronts.
I think the martyrdom of Nelson Mandela, as it was portrayed, did of course have huge propaganda value to the ANC. And though Mandela had in fact been sentenced to prison for sabotage, had participated in something like 170 sabotage attacks, some of which had indeed put lives at risk. This was increasingly being forgotten in the kind of message that was being spread around the world, that Mandela was a prisoner of conscience who had now been held by the apartheid regime for decades, even though he hadn't ever really done anything other than peacefully oppose apartheid. And this message was extremely useful in helping to generate sympathy for the ANC and to whip up anger against the apartheid government and its supposed surrogates such as Inkatha. In the end, when Nelson Mandela was released, he was also, of course, extremely useful to the ANC in the People's War that then intensified threefold, because whatever he had said had such great propaganda value in the country and right around the world. Mandela's views were treated with the utmost respect. There was really no sense that Mandela might also be a politician whose perspective perspective on things might be coloured by his political views. They were seen as gospel.
But of course, Mandela being Mandela, the next day, as it were, the very next day, within 24 hours, he gave a press conference at Archbishop Tutu's house down the road here in Bishop's Court and made a completely different speech, talking about reconciliation, talking about the need to negotiate and to bring South Africans together. So it was almost two different speeches.
There is not a single political organization in this country, inside and outside Parliament, which can ever compare with the ANC in its total commitment to peace. And the armed struggle is merely defensive.
With the ANC out of exile and Mandela out of prison, the stage is set for negotiations about the future of South Africa. The first meeting between the leaders of the National Party and the ANC takes place at Groote Schuur in Cape Town. The National Party's initial stance for the structure of a new government, that of a system with two distinct houses.
There were different ideas to have a revolving presidency, to have a separate Senate and a House of Representatives.
And Kobie Coetzee released the National Party's Bill of Rights. It was not the final, but their version of it. And I read this document and I thought, good heavens, this is entirely executive-minded. The whole thing is written, if you like, giving most of the power to the government rather than to the citizen. And of course I realized that was one of the problems, that they were so executive-minded because they had been the executive authority for 46 years, nearly 50 years.
The ANC's opening position was not to have any provinces at all.
It was written from the opposite point of view, it was a sort of struggle Bill of Rights, but what it did was it put in, and we still have them today, second and third generation rights. Good heavens, you guys are going to become the government. You're going to have to deliver on all this stuff.
They were not very keen on free market economics. It was not very keen on any constitutional limitation on the power of the state. And if you look at the ANC's strategy and tactics documents, you'll see that throughout their campaign was determined by the National Democratic Revolution. They did not negotiate in good faith. They had an agenda. They did not see 1994 as the solution, as the common goal. They saw it as a staging post on their continuing road toward the National Democratic Revolution.
But the National Party and the African National Congress are, of course, not the only role players. Others, however, become increasingly alienated from the process as it drags on. The Conservative Party is not interested in negotiating with the ANC and boycotts the process. Instead, it calls for the Afrikaners' right to self-determination.
The Conservative Party is not interested in a compromise between those two viewpoints. Our suggestion is very clear. We get the support of various black leaders as to the principle of self-determination.
Groups such as the Conservative Party and Inkatha soon organize themselves into an alliance with the aim of achieving self-determination for minority communities.
We were not part of the negotiations. We rejected them. We rejected Kempton Park, Azapo, and all the other arrangements because we were being sold out. And if you want to know why I'm saying so, the ANC had already left their camps and their commanders and leaders had already debased from the camps into the country before agreements and negotiations. But I think they were in a hurry to hold office. We openly rejected that and demanded that the liberation movement must first talk among itself as to how they are going to approach the negotiations in Kempton Park. And then we're kicked in the teeth for doing that.
The negotiations soon become a bilateral process, with the two major parties calling the shots and the others falling in line.
The main protagonists were the African National Congress and the National Party. So it had to be that they are the ones who, even when, during CODESA, had to steer the discussions, although other parties began to participate.
The ANC's chief negotiator is former COSATU leader Cyril Ramaphosa. The MP's team is led by Rolf Meyer.
It did become a bilateral, effectively, between the ANC and the National Party government. And, you know, Cyril Ramaphosa famously said, because CODESA, as it was called, operates on something called sufficient consensus. And he said, well, sufficient consensus means if the ANC and the National Party agree, everyone else can get stuffed. Now, as I was part of the 20 other parties, you kind of thought, well, what are we doing here?
Rolf Meyer had developed very positive relations with the main ANC negotiators. There seemed to be rapport between them.
The reason why he got the job was that he is a loyalist. He is loyal to the person who happens to be the National Party's leader at the moment. So F.W. Clerk knew that he was choosing somebody that would actually faithfully execute his instructions. I think the major weakness of the National Party in negotiations, they had no one with any, let's say, trade union experience, the trade unionists who actually realize how you actually conduct negotiations. But Rolf Meyer said, look, I have almost to learn from the start, you know. If you deal with Ramaphosa, you realize this guy had been in negotiations for 10, 15 years, very, very tough negotiations with the mining houses. Here I have to learn from scratch. He said, you don't read that kind of stuff in books, you know, which is very, very true.
In the meantime, violence reaches unprecedented levels. On the weekend of Mandela's release, 50 people are killed in political violence in Natal. On the Monday that follows, another 50 are murdered as violence starts to spread to other parts of the country. The ANC adopts a strategy which they refer to as the parallel paths to power. Once again, it is the black townships who are caught in the crossfire.
Yes, there was an increase. That is the time when a lot of people, former people, died. So there was that increase. That's where people were neglected and so on.
Violence escalated drastically.
But we had to leave in a hurry because of an ugly mood and even threats against our lives.
As we are here to kill Inkatha.
I would say that a war at that stage broke out between the ANC-SAP alliance and Inkatha.
Black Africans were being attacked, massacred, actually on trains. I mean, there were trains going into Johannesburg where people were being hacked to death with people with pangas.
The attackers in a train.
In the crowd.
It's a period where the tensions are rising in the townships around Johannesburg. The violence in KwaZulu-Natal is increasing. Hundreds, several thousand are dying. And this is taking place on the streets of Johannesburg itself.
There was a lot of violence in the townships. That ANC control was established in many townships in a very violent way.
The situation was really very bad.
It's vicious and it's deadly and it's destabilizing things.
The ANC from the start realized that the constitutions are not decidable at the negotiating table. It's decided in terms of the balance of power. And the ANC used the negotiations and they brought about 10,000 to 15,000 people who had been living beyond South Africa's borders, and they brought them back into the country where they assisted the ANC struggle. And I think the ANC basically had succeeded in gaining control over the black townships by 1992, 1993, sometimes through violent action, sometimes through people just deciding that they are the future government.
Part of what the ANC had learned from Vietnam was that negotiations could be used as a terrain of struggle. In other words, you could embark on negotiations and at the same time intensify all elements of the People's War, with the aim of putting so much pressure on negotiators that in the end they would start conceding things which they wouldn't otherwise have done.
The negotiations take place at a large conference called the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. However, after the first round of CODESA talks, the National Party finds itself in political hot water as the Conservative Party, led by Dr. Andries Treenicht, starts to gain substantial ground at the expense of the National Party.
Wie op aarde sal u glo as u praat van waarborge teen oorheersing? Waarborge teen oorheersing. Die ANC stel nie belang in magsdeling nie. Hy stel net belang in die oorgawe van mag, dit wil sê oorheersing, en as meneer de Klerk se verteenwoordigers by die onderhandelingstafel dit nie vir hulle gee nie, dan sê hulle sal dit met die gewapende stryd vat. Maar weet jy, daar is mense wat hulle hoop daarop vestig, wat sê, meneer F.W. de Klerk het nog iets as hemel. Hy het nog iets as hemel. Kom ons sê dit reguit. As jy nie volkere se reg op hulle eie regering, hulle eie wetgewing, grondgebied, onderwys, veiligheid, begroting en so meer erken en in stand hou nie, dan is 'n handves van menseregte 'n blufspel. Dis 'n blufspel.
The inner circle of the National Party becomes rattled, and de Klerk responds with decisive action. He calls for a referendum during which white South Africans must vote whether or not the National Party must continue with negotiations.
Leaves President de Klerk isolated from his own people. He hasn't got a mandate, and he should resign and call a general election for the white people of this country.
Many of de Klerk's own advisors, his closest colleagues in the National Party, agreed with us that the National Party was losing ground. He didn't. He felt that there was a solid base for transformation among white South Africans. And so he took the great and bold decision to hold an all-white referendum. And in the end, he won with almost 70%. So he called the situation correctly. But if he'd lost the referendum, he would have had to have resigned and called an all-white election.
De Klerk gains a resounding victory in the referendum. The question that remains a matter for debate, however, is the extent of the mandate that is given to de Klerk and the National Party in terms of the referendum.
In fact, the question in the referendum of March 1992 was also misleading. It was just asked, are you in favor of the continuation of negotiations for a new constitution? The whites never had any idea that they would cede power. You know, there would be a fairly conventional majority rule. In fact, the National Party put a major full-page poster advertisement in the newspapers. If you are against majority rule, vote yes. That is, you vote for what the National Party would want.
It was a very broad mandate. It was, do you want the National Party to continue with the negotiations aimed at a new constitution? I think that was more or less the wording.
To this extent, the Conservative Party were 100% correct, as Dr. Van Zyl Slabbert wrote subsequently. When de Klerk made a speech on the 2nd of February 1990 and started the process, it was, as Slabbert said, a comprehensive sellout of everything the National Party had held near and dear since 1948. Well, that's what it was. But in 1992, look, of course, the National Party did, even within the realms of political advertising, they certainly oversold their promises to their white electorate. That the whites, you know, were promised more protection, if you like, by the National Party at the time of referendum. Yes, they were. Did they get it? No, they didn't, in terms of the promises made at that referendum.
With renewed determination on the side of the National Party following its victory in the 1992 referendum, a second round of negotiations at Codesa starts shortly afterwards. The negotiations don't last long, however, as it is once again interrupted by events away from the negotiation table.
At the second meeting of Codesa, which happened on the 15th of May 1992, the ANC lost a crucial vote on whether South Africa should be a centralized or federal system. 7 organizations backed the ANC and 11 voted against it. And because the ANC had lost the vote at Codesa on this point that was so crucial to it, the ANC criticized Codesa in various ways, said it would have to reconsider its participation in Codesa. And meantime, it started resorting to ever more mass action, accompanied as always by coercion and intimidation to make sure that people participated. It also intensified its attacks against Inkatha, and particularly against Inkatha supporters who had holed up in a hostel called Madala, the old one, in the Waipotong area. 3 Inkatha supporters were necklaced around about the 16th of June, which was of course the commemoration of the Soweto revolt, and which the ANC had hoped would see a great upsurge in mass action in support of its call for a sort of alternative to the CODESA process. That upsurge of mass action didn't happen. Inkatha decided to take revenge for the necklacings and the other attacks to which its porters had been subjected over the years. So Inkatha launched a mass attack against Boipatong.
Late afternoon today, more than 15 hours after a group of gunmen went on a killing spree through this normally quiet residential area, police were still having difficulty in tracing the bodies of victims killed in their own homes.
The Boipatong massacre takes place of some 50 people or so butchered on the West Strand.
Innocent people massacred that way.
And it had aimed primarily to target the youths organised into self-defence units that it thought were primarily responsible for the violence, but it couldn't find those youths, so it attacked randomly, and it killed a number of men, women, children, who it happened to find in its path as it went.
Being 48 residents, including a baby. It was the worst of the massacres, and anti-government feeling rose to new heights.
As I say that, I don't deny that some of our people did have preemptive attacks. It was very bad because it almost turned into an ethnic war.
The ANC then effectively abandoned CODESA, and it used the Boipatong massacre as the excuse for doing so.
Mandela's view on that violence was that de Klerk was either complicit in it, or as representing the government, or at least at best negligence about black people losing their lives. So it created, in that sense, a terrible atmosphere, and it just increased the mistrust between the de Klerk government and the Mandela ANC, because Mandela became more and more angry about that and manifested his anger.
I can no longer explain to our people why we continue to talk to a government, to a regime, which is murdering our people.
The consequence of Boipatong was of huge significance and helped to the ANC. It internationalised the cause.
On behalf of all Australians, I have to say we are appalled at the continuing violence in South Africa. On the 17th of June, 39 innocent people, including women and children, were massacred at the township of Boipatong, and there were a further three further deaths and 20 casualties during President de Klerk's visit to the township on the 20th of June.
The cause of the ANC was reanimated in the world, if you like. De Klerk and his government were put in a very harsh light. So although he'd enjoyed, if you like, since 1990, a great following wind of international approval, this very much knocked him off his perch in the international community and elevated Mandela as the person who would help bring about change in South Africa in a more fundamental way. So yes, I think put the ANC in a much stronger position, and of course it used that position between the break-off of these negotiations and the resumption to strengthen its position on the ground, and it had a lot more moral force on its side, quite aside from support on the ground.
After Boipatong, the ANC begins to push more aggressively for acknowledgement that a so-called third force is responsible for the violence in the townships. These allegations will strengthen the ANC's legitimacy and severely damage the credibility of the National Party government.
We think that a third force was in operation,
which we know were military intelligence, police elements.
So very soon, ANC activists and organisations allied to the ANC, and then the ANC itself, began to allege that the attack on Boipatong had been carried out with the active help and involvement of the police.
Well, in fact, it's been disproved. It was disproved by the Truth and Reconciliation's own Amnesty Committee. They found that there had been no government involvement. They had foreign police involvement who also looked into this and could also find no trace at all of government involvement. But why spoil a good story?
We will leave no stone unturned to establish the truth.
And allegations by the ANC that the police were slow in reacting.
These allegations will be investigated as well. They will be intensively investigated. And I give the assurance that we will take every step necessary to establish the truth.
There was no evidence of police involvement, but a merely attack by Inkatha had relatively little propaganda value, particularly if it was seen in the context of a tit-tat of violence between the ANC and Inkatha over many years.
So the ANC, knowing exactly what the case was, wrung every ounce of propaganda value from the incident that it could.
I must say that the ANC had totally exaggerated the importance of the so-called third force. The common factor is that the ANC was involved in virtually all the conflicts in the townships.
So the view that the police were part of the Waipaton massacre has never been endorsed by any kind of evidence. It's simply an allegation, but it's one that keeps on being repeated by the ANC and its supporters, and it's won enormous credence right around the world. It's widely believed, even though it's not true. And based on that allegation, the ANC then broke off negotiations, and it left de Klerk, as it were, twisting in the wind, because he needed to bring negotiations to a close before 1994, which was when the next election had to be held under the existing constitution.
The ANC, through brilliant propaganda, had succeeded in presenting themselves to the public as almost innocent people just crying out for their freedom.
The country has not yet recovered from the news of the Waipaton massacre when it is shaken by another massacre that takes place in the town of Bisho.
So we had the Bisho massacre, which actually brought the negotiations together again, even though, I mean, that was a clear instance of ANC recklessness, led by Ronnie Kasrils, as I recall.
After the ANC withdrew from Kadesa and blamed de Klerk and Inkatha for Waipaton, it embarked on a process of rolling mass action. It began to talk about insurrection as being a possible path to power. But of course, it didn't go immediately against the powerful Pretoria government and its police and army. It began to mobilize against the homelands that were, of course, weak links. And the Ciskei homeland was particularly weak.
Come September, there was a massive march organised by the ANC from King Williamstown into Bisho itself.
What the ANC began to say was that it was going to use this program of rolling mass action to throw Xhosa, who was the then leader of Ciskei, out of power.
We're getting into Bisho, we're going to sit in there, and we're chasing the pig out of the barn. In Xhosa, that was put, very strong statement which brought a roar of approval from the crowd. And amongst the people there was Chris Hani and myself, that the intention was to go into Bisho, where we would have a sit-down until Gozo's resignation or removal by Pretoria. We are not simply going to hold a meeting in the stadium. We're marching into Bisho. On the day, we mustered upward of 100,000 people. We had a mass rally in East London at a stadium, addressed by, amongst others, Cyril Ramaphosa, the Secretary General then of the ANC, Steve Tshwete, and others. I was sent out with a small reconnaissance party to the border to see what the situation was. Here and to remain here until the brigadier leaves.
But does that mean in the stadium, or does that mean a penetration elsewhere?
Well, we're on our way, so you'll see. I can't say any more than that because I've got to relay what we've seen to Cyril Ramaphosa and the regional leadership.
That perhaps, Antonio, we can just say one thing, that you can see the situation here. That it's clearly, emotions are probably going to run very high. And I think it's very important, before anything gets out of control, that in fact we do have the opportunity for shuttle diplomacy. And that, as you've said, your people are under control.
Sure.
They're quiet, and we've already seen Cyril Ramaphosa down below.
Sure.
And he said that when he got to this position, that we would have the opportunity to talk.
Absolutely.
And we, of course, are intermediaries here. We can't tell the soldiers clearly, you understand that.
Sure, we do.
We can say to you, and we can say to them, that the National Peace Committee, the Secretariat, lives inside the covers of the National Peace Accord.
The Ciskei government obviously mobilized to protect itself, perhaps not in the most sensible way, because it deployed contingents of the Ciskei Defence Force along the border, and particularly close to what was called the Bishu Stadium, which was just inside the Ciskei homeland, and from which it would be possible to march to Bishu itself.
There was a layout of razor wire from the road to corral us into the stadium. We saw that part of the surrounding fence of the stadium was actually broken open. There was a huge gap in it, and there were no police or soldiers anywhere near. So to us, it looked quite feasible that we could certainly go through to the stadium and continue through the gap in the fence and into Bishu.
But as regards the stadium, there was a hole in the fence near it, and Ronnie Castrolls, who was aware of that hole, decided that that was the way to try and open the path to Bishu. So he led a number of marchers at a trot into the stadium, and then he declined to stay there. Instead, he said the way to Bishu is open, and he started leading them through the gap in the fence towards the capital of the homeland.
We came into the stadium, we rallied people out through the gap in the fence. And as we came through the gap in the fence, they immediately opened fire on us.
I will go and see them just now.
And so the number of people killed rose eventually to something like 29, with hundreds of people wounded. It was a dreadful event which cost so many lives.
Really, basically, people were needlessly killed because they were being led to the slaughter on the result of ANC instructions.
Now, Ronnie Castrol seems to have led them into the field of fire, which he may well have been aware of. He seems perhaps to have been careless as to whether they were killed or not. But the result was again another propaganda coup for the ANC.
Well, I think we've paid a very high price. 28 people were killed. But I think we've achieved something. And the Ciskei probably is the example of the worst tyranny in our country. And I think yesterday's events were a glad bitterness. And people are angry. The South African government will have to do something extra if people's confidence in negotiations can actually be sustained.
It was that which put even more pressure on de Klerk to try and find some way of restarting the negotiations, giving impetus to them again. And it was after that that de Klerk entered into a record of understanding with the ANC.
In the 3 months of major turmoil, I mean, you had rolling mass action, you had the attempt to overthrow the government in the Ciskei, that F.W. de Klerk had decided that the most important imperative is to get the negotiations going again.
After the Bishu massacre, the government and the ANC returned to the negotiation table, this time for the drafting of an historic document that will have a significant impact on the negotiations. This latest agreement is entitled The Record of Understanding.
Well, you know, the Record of Understanding is perhaps most misunderstood record in our current history, because it's generally interpreted as being a major defeat for the government. But that is not the case. It was the ANC, after the Bishu incident, that returned to the negotiations.
What happened it's not always fully understood, because if you look at the agreement, it just almost looks as the ANC agrees to return to the negotiations. This is what you also get in the autobiography of Mr. de Klerk, and this is what Dave Stewart often states and so on. But what actually happened is that the ANC establishes its ascendancy over both the National Party and over Inkatha. It gets the National Party to release people who were in prison, who had committed major offences, but who couldn't get amnesty on account of the so-called Norgard principle. But the ANC forced de Klerk to free all these ANC prisoners, even if some of them had committed major crimes.
What is especially significant is the fact that the ANC expressly demands that prisoners who have been convicted for committing the so-called necklace murders must also be released.
The other objective of the ANC at the Record of Understanding was to break down the alliance, the informal alliance between the National Party and Inkatha. And they did so by getting the government to agree to surrounding Inkatha hostels, and also a ban on carrying any traditional weapons in demonstrations. Now that's only Inkatha was doing that. So it succeeded in actually infuriating Inkatha, and especially Chief Buthelezi. And that was a crucial victory for the ANC, because Buthelezi was now isolated.
I think the National Party negotiators did not have an overall strategy. I think de Klerk, incidentally, was a brilliant tactician. Great tactician. He could pull out a tactic. The roof was coming in on him when he lost the Potchefstroom through a by-election. He calls a referendum. He destroys the right wing as a force in politics forever and a day with that single move. But on the other hand, he didn't have an overall strategy. He could see the hill, but he couldn't see the mountain range. That was what I thought. So, for example, the National Party put all their eggs power sharing at the executive level in the cabinet. Well, eventually they didn't get it. But instead of concentrating on other matters that I think were absolutely far more significant, or as significant, they, in a sense, underplayed them or never put them on the table. So my greatest criticism, without going into detail, of the National Party is they made a fundamental mistake. They thought the longer this thing played on, or out, time would be on their side. They didn't realize that once the process had started, they would very quickly be controlled by the process rather than that they would control the process. And I think that is a mistake which happens if you've been in power for 46 years. You are expert in all matters of administration, which indeed they were, but you are woefully unprepared for bare-knuckled negotiation, which the ANC was extremely prepared for. I mean, the ANC undoubtedly out-negotiated the National Party. That's the bottom line of CODESA.
Chris Hani, a major leader within the ANC alliance, the Secretary General of the South African Communist Party and commander of Umkhonto we Sizwe, is gunned down in front of his house in Boksburg.
The death of Chris Hani was a very significant event. It almost led to a total breakdown and all-round civil war.
Die bijeenkomst van duisende mense in Kaapstad se middestad het gou 'n orgie van geweld en plunder ontaard. ANC-beamptes het beheer oor die skare verloor en groepe mense het tussen die winkels begin inbeweeg.
Well, in fact, it happened on the 10th of April, 1993, which was over Easter. And I got this news, I got in touch with the president. We immediately, of course, issued a statement.
Eventually, we charged Yadis Wallace, as well as Mr. Clive Dowie-Lewis, for the murder of Hani and sentenced to life imprisonment.
You know, the assassination of one of the major leaders of the ANC by two right-wingers who happened to be white could have tipped this country over.
F.W. de Klerk was not going to be able to call for calm to the majority of black people. It would have to be Mandela. So de Klerk got in touch with Nelson Mandela and said, look, this is potentially a national crisis. You are in the best position to call for calm. And that is exactly what Mandela did. He rose to the occasion and he helped to defuse what could have been a very, very dangerous situation indeed.
You know, there are some tipping points in history. That was a tipping point, and Mandela did help pull it back, and that did absolutely establish him as the most significant force, which he was going to become. I mean, you could add up, you would realize Mandela was going to be president. I just think it hastened the passage of power, that event. But the political consequence of that was to get the ANC what it wanted, which was an election date. And once, of course, the election date had been established, in June 1993, the ANC could sit back and know that, well, in 9 months' time, we're going to be in power. So suddenly the forces were now realigned very much in the ANC's favor. So violence played a very significant role at many points in the constitutional negotiations, and of course before.
Although an election date has been announced, Inkatha is still fixed on boycotting the elections.
The IFP had also refused to take part in negotiations from the time of the Record of Understanding because it saw that the NP was simply going to capitulate to what the ANC wanted. And it also refused to participate in the election because it saw it as effectively the culmination of an entirely illegitimate exercise in which the ANC had gained what it had gained through the use of violence.
On the 28th of March 1994, about 20,000 Inkatha supporters gather in the streets of Johannesburg to march to the ANC's headquarters, also known as Shell House, in protest against the approaching elections.
There was no way in which we could have allowed people to march to Shell House. So we were prepared that as soon as they reach a certain point, there would be no further movement.
But the marchers cross that point. Mandela gives the instruction, and ANC security forces open fire on the protesters. At least 19 Inkatha protesters are shot dead.
What the people shoot all the Zulus in town for the attended meeting. Plenty people on the flats. So now plenty people now died there.
The Shell House massacre was a rather shocking event too, because there's no evidence that the IFP supporters posed any kind of a threat to the ANC headquarters. Yet ANC security guards at the balcony of the building and elsewhere opened fire on them, and there were shootings elsewhere in Johannesburg too, in which IFP supporters were killed.
But the election, I don't feel all right if the guys shoot another guys. So I'm not happy for other people to shoot another people for the election. The election, one of the guys was for the guy for the shooting. I not feel all right.
With no other options left and less than a month to the elections, Buthelezi decides to register the Inkatha Freedom Party and participate. Although the polls at this stage indicate a victory for the ANC and a dramatic decline in support for Inkatha and other rival organizations, Buthelezi realizes that his organization will vanish if he does not take this final step.
For all South Africans, an unforgettable occasion. It is the realization of hopes and dreams that we have cherished over decades. The dreams of a South Africa. It is the beginning of a new era.
It's a day that we've been waiting for, and to have the opportunity to participate in an election in our country. Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, the way the process came about it hasn't really created, the kind of jubilation which would have been there if there hadn't been so much bitterness and efforts to keep us out of the process.
I'm glad that there is such enthusiasm. It augurs well for the future. It will ensure that this government of national unity will be fully representative of all the people, and that those who boycott this election will be clearly identified as a very small minority.
Good morning, Mr. De Klerk. Good morning.
But it's the levels of violence that accompanies the crime. People get murdered for stealing a cell phone in this country. Now, a lot of crime happens elsewhere, but ours is particularly violent. And I do think that we unleashed forces in the struggle to change South Africa, which are very difficult to put back again.
If the ANC had not intensified its People's War, if we'd not had 15,000 deaths in that period, with 1,000, in fact, in the few months before the election, we could have had a negotiations process in which everybody was fixed more on what would be in the best interests of the country. Instead, we ended up with a solution that was in the best interests of the ANC, and the two are not the same.
Once you have taught a younger person or a person to deal with problems with violence, even when the problems are internal, they will use violence.
Oh, I think history is written by the winners, unfortunately. There are very few people who write history in a dispassionate way. But the narrative given by the ANC is a very distorted one. They appear heroic and no one else contributed to change in South Africa, except if you were on the approved list, and equally the forces that they were up against were utterly demonic. Well, of course, the reality is much more complex than that, as we know. So I don't think you get a true version of history. I think you get a very partial version of history. And it's a pity, because one of the consequences of democracy should be a more inclusive history. One of the things about being a citizen, a free citizen, or a citizen of a free country, is to make an informed choice. And to do that, you need the information. So South Africa, to me, is an abnormal democracy. What makes it abnormal is the fact that despite all these predations and power, the ruling party is going to win a very hefty majority, because we have a lot of other factors that go into people marking their ballots. So my two wishes are that we can get to a point where our democracy becomes a normal democracy, and where we can deal with the past, but not always take it into the future. That's probably a big wish, but that's what I would hope for.
But how black people deal with each other now? How children as young as 2 months are being abused and raped by people who are much older. How they are maimed. Every day you open the newspaper, you open television, this is what you see. And it's not happening in the white community. If it does, somebody's sick. But we are sick as a society. A larger group, we are sick in the manner in which we do things. And the government of the day is responsible for whatever is happening.